From the fire came Miss Eliza Hartwell, coughing through the smoke, her sleeves scorched, her hands blackened, and an old leather gun case dragging behind her across the wet grass. The abandoned hunting lodge cracked behind her as flames climbed through the roof. Rain battered the trees. Smoke rolled over the ground. Eliza did not know what she had saved. She only knew the case had been locked in a burning cabinet marked with an ancient family crest, and something in her heart refused to leave it there to be swallowed by fire. Then the riders came. Lanterns cut through the storm. Horses reared at the smoke. Men shouted. And at the center of them, still as judgment itself, sat Gabriel Ashford, Duke of Ravensmere, the most feared man in the county. His eyes dropped from Eliza's ruined gown to the leather case at her feet. The latch had broken open. Inside lay an old rare hunting gun, silver-worked, dark-polished, and engraved with the Ashford crest. The Duke dismounted slowly. For one breath, Eliza thought he would thank her. Instead, his voice came cold enough to silence every man behind him. That gun has been locked away for years. Tell me, miss, whether you broke into my lodge before or after you set it burning. Eliza stared at him, smoke still burning in her throat. She had run into fire to save what belonged to him. And now the feared Duke was calling her a thief. The rain came sideways that night. It drove against the trees in long, hissing sheets, turning the lane into mud and the sky into something without edges. Miss Eliza Hartwell pulled her shawl tighter and kept walking. The prentice child had been feverish since morning, and she had stayed too long, she knew it, but the boy's mother had frightened eyes and no one else to sit beside her, and Eliza had never been good at leaving a room that still needed her. She was nearly past the ridge that separated the village from the old Ravensmere woodland when she smelled it. Not wood smoke from a hearth. Something older. Something wrong. She stopped. Through the tree line, perhaps 200 yards off the lane, a glow pulsed against the dark, warm and terrible and alive in the way that fires become alive when they have found something worth consuming. Above the tree line, a column of smoke rose and then bent sideways in the wind. The Ravensmere Hunting Lodge. Eliza knew the lodge the way everyone in Ashcombe knew it, not from experience, but from warning. It had been closed for years, people said. Shut up after something happened that nobody in polite company discussed too precisely. The Duke's land ran along the entire eastern edge of the village, and the lodge sat at the boundary of it like a locked sentence nobody had finished. Trespassing there was not simply a legal offense. It was the kind of thing that followed a person. She stood at the edge of the lane, rain running cold down the back of her neck, and looked at the fire. If anyone is inside. She did not let herself finish the thought. She moved. The front door was already open when she reached it, hanging at an angle, as if pushed rather than broken, which struck her as strange even then. No lantern. No horse. No voice calling for help from any window. Just the fire working its way through the interior, beginning in the back and spreading forward along walls hung with old maps and faded cloth. Eliza wrapped her shawl across her mouth and stepped inside. The entry room was still breathable, barely. She moved quickly, not touching anything she did not need to touch, eyes scanning for any sign of a person trapped. There was none. But along the far wall, a cabinet stood half engulfed in flame, heavy, locked, and marked across its face with a carved crest. She did not know the crest precisely, but she knew what crests meant. They meant family. They meant someone, once, had considered the contents worth protecting. The fire had reached the cabinet's left side. The wood was beginning to blacken. She pulled off her shawl entirely and wrapped it around her hands. The latch was hot. She worked at it anyway, and when the mechanism refused her, she tried the hinge, and when the hinge refused her, she found that the fire had already done part of the work. The bottom panel had begun to warp and separate. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. The case inside was leather, old and dark, heavier than she expected. She dragged it across the floor. Through the entry. out into the rain. She did not stop until the cold hit her lungs like a fist. Then she stood in the wet grass, coughing, hands burned red at the palms, and looked down at the case now lying open at her feet. The latch had broken on the way out. Inside, cushioned in cracked velvet, lay a hunting gun unlike anything she had seen. Silverwork traced the length of the stock. A crest, the same crest, had been engraved along the barrel with the kind of care that took a craftsman months. This was not merely valuable. This was kept. Before we continue, what do you think Eliza does next? Does she wait for help, or does she try to leave before anyone finds her? She was still looking at it when the riders came. There were 6 of them, lanterns swinging in the wet dark, horses stamping and wheeling at the smell of smoke. Men shouted to each other across the noise. One called for water. Another pointed at the lodge with something between alarm and anger. And then the center of them went still. The Duke of Ravensmere did not shout. He did not need to. He dismounted with the deliberate calm of a man who had trained himself out of visible feeling, walked forward through the mud as if the rain were not happening, and stopped when he was close enough that Eliza could see his face clearly by lantern light. He looked at the gun case. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only she and the nearest riders could hear it. That piece has not left my family's keeping in 80 years. A pause. Tell me why it is in your hands. Eliza's throat still burned. Her palms were beginning to blister. She was standing in the rain in a ruined dress with an ancient heirloom at her feet and 6 men on horseback watching her. She did not shrink. Because it would have burned, she said, if it had stayed in yours. The silence that followed was the worst kind, not empty, but full of men recalibrating what they had assumed. The Duke's expression did not change. The lodge has been locked. His eyes moved briefly to the open door, then back. As has that cabinet. You will explain how you came to be on my land at this hour. She explained. Clearly, without embellishment, without apology. She had seen smoke from the lane. She had entered because she feared someone might be trapped. She had found the cabinet marked with his family's crest, and when the fire reached it, she removed what was inside. She did not know what the gun was. She only knew it was his. He listened in a way that looked like disbelief dressed as patience. Then he gave the order to have her escorted home. He added that a physician should be sent if the smoke had caused harm. He said it the way a man manages a problem, efficiently, without warmth, and turned back toward the burning lodge. The riders and servants had heard everything. That was the part Eliza did not speak of afterward. She was not naive. A poor gentlewoman found at night on a duke's land, holding a family heirloom, with a fire at her back, the facts arranged themselves into an ugly shape regardless of the truth inside them. Reputation in a village like Ashcombe was not rebuilt easily once people had seen something they could interpret badly. She walked home in the physician's cart without speaking. That same night, in his study at Ravensmere Hall, Gabriel Ashford set the case on his desk and opened it. He was not sure what he was looking for. What he found was a strip of scorched wool caught in the hinge, torn from a shawl, he realized. And along the leather side of the case, where a person would grip it hardest to drag it across a floor, the soot had been pressed in by a pair of hands working with considerable desperation. He sat back. A thief takes the object and leaves. A thief does not wrap her hands in her own shawl, drag a heavy case through a burning room, and stand in the rain waiting to be found. He touched the engraved crest. And somewhere beneath the control he had spent years perfecting, something shifted. He remembered Nathaniel's hands on this same case. The sound of his younger brother's voice, younger then, lighter, before their father died, and everything afterward became a series of arguments Gabriel had won and a door that had been closed and never opened again. He could not have said exactly when he stopped sleeping that night. He only knew that the line he could not stop hearing was not the one he had spoken. It was hers. because it would have burned if it had stayed in yours. Morning came grey and reluctant. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the village of Ashcombe washed clean and quietly watchful, the kind of morning that feels like it is listening. Eliza sat at the small table by the cottage window with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had stopped drinking, watching the lane outside with the careful stillness of someone who already knew the day was going to require something of her. Her throat still burned when she swallowed. Her palms, wrapped loosely in linen strips, ached with a dull persistence that she found easier to ignore than to acknowledge. The dress she had worn the night before was beyond saving. Her aunt had folded it away in silence, which was its own kind of verdict. Mrs. Hartwell had not yet said everything she was thinking. Eliza could tell by the way she moved around the kitchen, too precisely, too quietly, setting things down with the careful control of a woman organizing her words before she released them. It did not take long. "They will talk," her aunt said at last, not unkindly, setting a plate down across from Eliza and taking the chair opposite. "You know they will. They can talk about what actually happened." "Eliza!" Her aunt's voice held the particular patience of someone who has had this argument before, in different forms, across many years. "What actually happened is not the part they will repeat." Eliza looked at her. Mrs. Hartwell folded her hands on the table. She was not a cruel woman, nor a cowardly one. She was simply a woman who had lived long enough to understand that truth and reputation were not the same currency, and that only one of them bought bread. A young woman, she said carefully, found alone at night on the Duke of Ravensmere's estate, holding a family heirloom, while his lodge burned behind her. She let that sit. It does not matter what you intended. What matters is how it arranges itself in the mind of someone who was not there. I saved it. I know you did. He accused me in front of his men. I know that too. Her aunt reached across and touched her hand, briefly, above the linen wrapping. And I am not saying you were wrong. I am saying that being right costs more when you have less to spend. The knock came at 9:30. Not a servant's knock, that particular rhythm that announces itself as a formality, a task being completed. This was considered deliberate. The knock of someone who had thought about it on the way to the door. Mrs. Hartwell answered it. She came back to the kitchen doorway with an expression Eliza had never seen on her aunt's face before, something caught between alarm and a very careful composure. "It is the Duke," she said. "He has brought Mr. Vale and a physician. And," she paused, as if the detail still puzzled her, "a cloak. Why do you think Gabriel brought the cloak himself rather than simply sending it? What does that tell you about where his mind was the night before?" He stood in the narrow front room of the cottage the way tall men sometimes stand in small spaces, not awkwardly, but with a conscious restraint, as if he had decided before entering to make himself take up less. Mr. Vale, his steward, remained near the door. The physician, a quiet older man named Dr. Hewell, stood to one side with his bag. The cloak was folded over Gabriel's arm. Dark wool, good quality, unadorned. He had not sent the grandest thing in his household. He had sent something practical. Eliza stood. They looked at each other across the small room, and the silence was the kind that carries the weight of everything said the night before. Gabriel set the cloak on the chair nearest him. "I spoke too quickly last night," he said. "It was not a bad beginning. It was precise, controlled, and cost him something." She could see that in the set of his jaw, in the slight pause before he produced the words. A man like Gabriel Ashford did not revise himself easily or often. The sentence had the quality of something practiced. But Eliza had spent the morning sitting with what those words had cost her. "You judged too quickly, Your Grace," she said. Speaking was only the last part of it. The room was very quiet. Mr. Vale studied the floor. Dr. Hewell became occupied with the clasp of his bag. Mrs. Hartwell, behind Eliza, made no sound at all. Gabriel did not flinch. But something in his expression shifted, not offense, which she had half expected, but something closer to recognition. As if she had identified a thing he already knew to be true and had hoped might pass unremarked. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You are correct." 2 words. But they were the right 2 words, and Eliza felt the shape of the morning change slightly around them. Dr. Hewell was permitted to examine her hands and throat. The burns were superficial, he said. She had been careful, or lucky, or both. He left a small tin of salve and instructions that were sensible and brief. Gabriel watched the examination without expression, but he watched it entirely, which told Eliza more than his silence suggested. When the physician had finished, Gabriel asked the question she had known was coming. "Why did you go in?" "I told you last night." "You told me the facts," he said. "I am asking something else." Eliza considered him. The cottage light was thin and grey, falling across the sharp planes of his face without flattery, and she thought that he looked, in this room, less like the feared Duke of County Gossip and more like a man who had not slept and was trying to understand something that genuinely troubled him. "Because someone once loved it," she said. He was still. "How could you know that?" he asked. "You did not know what was inside the case." "I knew the cabinet was marked with a family crest and locked shut in a building no one had entered in years." She kept her voice even. "Things are not kept that carefully, for that long, unless they carry a person inside them. Valuable things get sold. Things that are kept, truly kept, belong to someone's grief, or someone's memory, or both." She paused. "I did not know whose. I only knew it was not mine to leave behind." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Quieter. More interior. Gabriel looked at her for a long moment, not with the assessing coldness of the night before, but with the expression of a man encountering something unexpected in a place he thought he had already mapped. He picked up his hat from the table. "The physician's bill will be sent to my steward," he said. And then, at the door, "I am glad the smoke did not harm you more than it did, Miss Hartwell." It was not poetry. But it was real. He was nearly back to his horse when he passed the parish room. He had not intended to stop. The lane ran close to the building, and he was moving with purpose. He had an estate to manage and a burned lodge to assess and a mourning that had already exceeded its planned uses. He slowed only because he heard voices. Children's voices, reciting something in uneven chorus. Then a pause. Then a single voice, patient, unhurried, saying the line again. He stopped. Through the window, which was propped open despite the cold, he could see Eliza standing at the front of the room. She was not looking at the class as a whole. She was looking at a boy in the second row who had gone still with the particular stillness of a child bracing for humiliation. The boy had lost his place. That much was clear. What happened next was not what Gabriel expected. Eliza did not single him out. She did not repeat the question. She simply moved closer to him, lowered her voice so that the rest of the class could not quite hear, and said something that made the boy straighten slightly and try again. When he got the line right, she moved back to the front without comment or ceremony. No praise designed to highlight the failure it followed. Just the quiet restitution of dignity. Gabriel stood at the window longer than he had intended. "Before we continue, what do you think he is really seeing in that classroom? Is it Eliza, or is it something he recognizes from much further back?" He left without entering. But he did not forget what he had seen. Later that same afternoon, Lady Cassandra Marbury arrived at Ravensmere Hall. She came, as she often did, without the drama of announcement, simply with the certainty of a woman who had never had reason to doubt her welcome. She was elegant in the precise way that requires effort but must never appear to, and she moved through Gabriel's receiving room with the ease of someone who had already half decided it belonged to her future. "I heard about the fire," she said, accepting tea with a graceful hand. "Dreadful business. And some village woman was found with the heirloom, I understand." "A Miss Hartwell," Gabriel said. She pulled the gun case from the cabinet before the fire reached it. "How remarkable." Cassandra's tone did not change, which was itself a kind of precision. "And she simply happened to be there. She was returning from the Prentice household. The lane runs near the lodge." "Of course." She set her cup down. "You were generous to send the physician. That speaks well of you." A pause, measured as a chess move. Only gratitude to people below one's station can be so easily misread. By the village, I mean. People will draw their own conclusions about why a duke would take such a personal interest. Gabriel looked at her steadily. "She saved something irreplaceable," he said. "The interest is proportionate." Cassandra smiled, the kind of smile that concedes a point without surrendering a position. "Of course it is." She moved the conversation elsewhere with practiced grace, and Gabriel let her, because the alternative was a confrontation he was not yet ready to name. But the irritation sat with him long after she had gone, the particular irritation of hearing a person reduced to a social calculation by someone who had never been required to be brave. 3 days later, a cart arrived at the parish schoolroom. It carried a wooden crate from the Ravensmere library, 26 volumes, ranging from readers and grammar primers to illustrated natural histories and a well-worn atlas. No letter accompanied it. Only a brief note in a formal hand. For the use of the schoolroom. No return is expected or required. Eliza stood in the doorway of the parish room looking at the crate for a long moment. She understood what it was. Not charity. Charity would have been money, impersonal and slightly insulting. This was attention. He had noticed what the room lacked, and he had answered it in the specific language of what she actually did. She wrote back the same evening. 1 paragraph. Formal, precise, and sincere, thanking him for the gift without inflating it, acknowledging the thought behind it without making it into something he had not yet said it was. Gabriel read the note twice at his desk that night. Then a third time, slowly, as if pace might reveal something speed had missed. It was on that same night, looking for a document in the lower drawer of his desk, a survey of the lodge's remaining structure, that his hand found something else inside the gun case. Slipped beneath the velvet lining. Small and folded, the paper gone soft with age. He recognized the handwriting before he finished unfolding it. Nathaniel. The note was short. A few lines only, written in the easy, unguarded hand of a young man who did not yet know he was writing something that would outlast him. It mentioned the lodge. It mentioned a morning shooting they had planned together, a morning, Gabriel now remembered, that he had cancelled without explanation because his calendar had been full and his patience for Nathaniel's undisciplined grief had, in that particular week, run out. At the bottom of the note, in his brother's loose script. "You promised." "I have not forgotten." Gabriel sat very still for a long time. He had saved nothing from that fire. He had not entered the burning lodge. He had not gone near that cabinet in years because going near it would have required acknowledging what it held. It had taken a stranger, a poor schoolmaster's daughter returning home in the rain, to do the thing he had been too armored to do himself. He folded the note carefully and set it on the desk beside his untouched glass. Memory, he was beginning to understand, did not wait to be invited. It simply waited. And now it was here, unfolded on his desk, in his brother's hand, asking for a morning that could no longer be given. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. It was written in a formal hand on paper that smelled faintly of beeswax and old wood, the kind of stationery that announced, without needing to say so, that it came from a house where things were done correctly. The wording was precise, courteous, and entirely proper. His Grace the Duke of Ravensmere requested the pleasure of Miss Eliza Hartwell and Mrs. Hartwell's company at Ravensmere Hall on Thursday next, at 2 o'clock, for the purpose of a formal acknowledgment of Miss Hartwell's service during the recent fire at the estate lodge. Mrs. Hartwell read it twice, then set it on the table between them with the careful reverence of someone handling a document that could go either way. "We should go," she said. Eliza looked at the invitation without touching it. "He wants to display me," she said, "as proof that he has corrected himself." "Perhaps." Her aunt folded her hands. "Or perhaps he wants to thank you properly and does not know another way to begin." She paused. Either way, Eliza, refusing a duke's invitation in a village this size is not a neutral act. People will ask why. And the answers they invent will be worse than whatever happens if you go. Eliza knew her aunt was right. She had known it before the sentence was finished. She wrote back the same afternoon. Brief, composed, and accepting. Thursday came with pale winter light and frost still on the grass at mid-morning. The carriage Gabriel sent was not ostentatious, a plain, well-kept vehicle, no crests on the door, which Eliza noticed and appreciated more than she expected to. It was the choice of someone who had thought about how it would look for her to be seen arriving. The gates of Ravensmere Hall opened onto a long gravel approach, and as the carriage moved up it, Eliza looked at the house through the window with the composed attention she gave to things she needed to understand before she encountered them. It was very large, very old, and very, very still. Ravensmere Hall had the beauty of a place that had been maintained with absolute precision and inhabited with very little warmth. The floors in the entrance hall were polished to a mirror finish that reflected the grey light from tall windows. The ancestral portraits along the main corridor were hung at exact intervals, the frames dusted, the subjects looking out with the unanimous expression of people who had decided long ago that feeling too much was beneath their station. The fires were lit. The rooms were clean. Everything was in its proper place. And yet the house had the quality of a held breath, as if it were waiting for permission to relax that had never quite arrived. Eliza said nothing about this. But she noticed it the moment she walked through the door, and she did not stop noticing it. Gabriel received them in the drawing-room. He was dressed simply for a duke, dark coat, no excess, and he stood when they entered, which was a small thing that nonetheless registered. He greeted Mrs. Hartwell with the correct courtesies, asked after her comfort from the journey, and arranged for tea with the efficiency of a man who had rehearsed the logistics of the afternoon carefully. Then he turned to Eliza. "Miss Hartwell." A pause, brief, but not empty. "I am glad you came. Thank you for the invitation, Your Grace." They looked at each other for a moment in the way that people do when there is a previous conversation still unfinished between them and both parties are deciding whether today is the day to finish it. He said, "The piece you saved has been restored. I thought you should see it." "I would like that," she said. It was not poetry. But it was real, and it was careful, and Eliza recognized in it the effort of a man trying to do something correctly that he had not been taught how to do. What do you think Eliza is most guarded against in this moment, being used as a symbol of his redemption, or allowing herself to want something she has decided she cannot have? The library was at the far end of the east wing, past rooms that grew quieter and more private as they walked. Mrs. Hartwell had been settled comfortably near the drawing-room fire with the housekeeper, a practical arrangement that both women accepted with the mutual understanding of people who know when they are being sensibly managed. The library itself was the warmest room Eliza had seen in the house, not in temperature, but in character. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling. A fire burned steadily. The smell was paper and leather and something older underneath, the smell of a room that had been used and thought in and returned to across many years. On the central table, the gun case sat open. The leather had been cleaned and oiled. The velvet lining had been carefully pressed. The gun itself lay as it must have lain for decades before the fire, silver work catching the light, the engraved crest precise and undiminished. Eliza looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she looked at Gabriel. He was standing 2 feet from the table, perfectly composed, and he had not touched it. She did not ask directly. She simply said, quietly, "Some memories become harder to hold than to lose." The room was very still. Gabriel looked at the gun case for a long moment. Then he said, with the careful precision of a man measuring each word before releasing it, "It belonged to my father. After he died, my younger brother Nathaniel used it." He stopped. Started again. He felt things with a force that I did not always know how to answer. After our father died, his grief was large and ungoverned, and another pause. I answered it with severity. I thought I was being steadying. I was being unkind. He said the last 3 words as if they had been waiting a long time to be spoken in this room. Their last conversation was bitter, he continued. I did not know it was the last one. I don't think either of us did. He went out riding the following morning, and he stopped. The accident was not the gun's fault. But I could not look at the case afterward without hearing what I had said the night before. The fire crackled. Eliza looked at the case, then at Gabriel, and she thought about what it meant to carry a grief that had a specific sentence inside it, a sentence you had spoken, that you could not unspeak, that lived in the objects the person had touched. My father was a schoolmaster, she said. He died when I was 19, leaving debts that surprised everyone who thought they knew him. People who had called him distinguished began to find reasons to cross the street. She kept her voice even. I still have his spectacles and 3 of his books. Not because they are valuable. Because when I look at them, I can remember that he was good before the debts made people decide he wasn't. Gabriel turned to look at her. Love remains in ordinary things, she said simply. It does not require permission. He said nothing for a moment. But the quality of his silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of a man withholding. It was the silence of a man receiving something he had not expected to be given. Mrs. Hartwell, as arranged by no one in particular, needed to rest for a short while after tea. The housekeeper, a sensible woman named Mrs. Crane who had worked at Ravensmere Hall for 30 years and understood the household's emotional weather better than anyone, suggested the sitting room near the south window, which was warm and had a good chair. Mrs. Hartwell agreed with the readiness of a woman who trusted that her niece was equal to an afternoon. Gabriel and Eliza walked in the garden. It was the correct and proper thing, within sight of the house, in daylight, with servants moving at various distances. And yet the garden had the quality of privacy that comes not from enclosure but from attention, the sense that within this particular stretch of gravel path and winter-bare hedgerow, the rest of the world had agreed, temporarily, to look elsewhere. Gabriel walked slightly slower than his natural pace. Eliza noticed this and said nothing about it. He showed her the formal beds, dormant now, and the old glass house along the south wall, and the stone fountain that had not run in several winters due to a crack in the basin that he mentioned with the faint, specific irritation of someone who has been meaning to address something and keeps finding reasons not to. Then they turned a corner near the east wall, and Eliza stopped. There was a stone arch, old and slightly overgrown, ivy thickening along its right side. And carved into the left pillar, at approximately the height a young man might reach when standing on uncertain footing to leave his mark, 2 initials. N.A. She did not ask. She simply looked at it, and then looked at Gabriel, and the understanding that passed between them required no words because the initials and the untrimmed ivy and the fact that everything else in this garden had been maintained to precision said everything that needed saying. He had not restored it because restoring it would mean admitting that the person who carved it was not coming back to see it done. He would have been 34 this year, Gabriel said. His voice was level. It cost him something to keep it that way. Eliza said, he carved it deep. He meant it to last. Gabriel looked at the arch for a long moment. Then he said, yes. He always did things as if he intended to return to them. They stood there quietly for a moment, not uncomfortably, but with the particular shared stillness of 2 people who have recognized, without announcement, that they are both carrying something heavy and have found themselves in the same place at the same time. His hand and hers were perhaps for inches apart on the garden path. Neither of them moved. Do you think Gabriel is aware yet of how much he has already told her, or does he not realize how far the door has opened? Lady Cassandra arrived at 3:30. She came with the practiced ease of a standing connection. She had been expected for tea, Gabriel explained, an arrangement made some days prior. Eliza absorbed this information with composure and told herself it was irrelevant. Cassandra entered the drawing room where the four of them had reconvened with the authority of a woman who had rehearsed for this room without knowing she had been rehearsing. She greeted Gabriel with warmth, Mrs. Hartwell with precise courtesy, and turned to Eliza with a smile that was faultlessly constructed. Miss Hartwell. Her eyes moved, briefly and completely, from Eliza's dress to her face and back. How generous of His Grace to open Ravensmere to village gratitude. The words were elegant. That was the danger of them. There was nothing to object to on the surface, only the thing underneath, the implication arranged beneath the politeness like a blade beneath silk. You are a curiosity here, and we both know it. Eliza felt the wound land with the precision it had been designed for. She drew breath to respond, calmly. She had already decided, and without apology. But Gabriel spoke first. Miss Hartwell is not here to offer gratitude. His voice was even, unhurried, and entirely final. She is here because I owed it. The room was quiet. Cassandra's smile did not falter. But something behind it recalibrated, a small, careful adjustment, like a chess player recognizing that the board has changed while they were looking at a different square. Mrs. Hartwell examined her teacup. Eliza looked at Gabriel. He did not look back immediately. He was already redirecting the conversation, asking Cassandra something about the county roads after the recent rain, but in the moment before he turned away, something passed across his expression that was not quite readable and not quite concealed. He had crossed a line. He knew it. And he had crossed it anyway. Cassandra left at 5 o'clock with perfect grace and said nothing further about Eliza for the remainder of her visit. Which was, in its own way, more unnerving than if she had. After she was gone, Gabriel asked Eliza about the parish schoolroom. Not ceremonially, practically, directly, the way a man asks a question when he actually intends to do something with the answer. She told him the truth. The room was cold in winter because the window seals were failing. The children sat in coats when the frost came. There were not enough desks for the older students. The books he had sent were the first new volumes the room had seen in 4 years. He listened without interrupting, which he was beginning to understand was not a small thing for him. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, the lodge will need to be rebuilt or demolished. The structure is still partially standing. He paused. I have been considering what it should become. He crossed to his desk and unrolled a set of plans, preliminary, clearly, hand-drawn rather than drafted, but detailed. The lodge, redesigned. Larger windows. A central room with a fireplace and long reading tables. A smaller room adjacent for younger children. Space for books along every wall. Eliza looked at the plans for a long time without speaking. This was not a charitable gesture. Charitable gestures were impersonal, money sent at a distance, acknowledgement without cost. This was something else. This was a man taking the place where his grief had been locked for years and asking, in the language of architectural plans and children's reading tables, whether it was possible to make memory into something that could be used rather than only endured. It's a good use of the space, she said at last, which was not nearly everything she meant. Gabriel looked at her steadily. I thought you might say whether it was the right use. I think, she said carefully, that you already know it is. He rolled the plans back up slowly. And neither of them said anything more about it, because sometimes the most significant things are the ones that do not require completion. On the carriage ride home, Mrs. Hartwell said nothing for the first 10 minutes. Then, he watches you when he thinks you are not looking. Eliza kept her eyes on the darkening lane outside. He is observant, she said. Eliza. He is a duke, aunt. Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. He was a duke this morning too, she said finally. He was something else this afternoon. Eliza did not answer. But she thought about the garden arch, and the plans on the desk, and the way he had spoken her name into a room where Cassandra had just tried to reduce her. She is here because I owed it, and she felt, quietly and without permission, the first true warmth of something she had not yet decided what to do with. That evening, at Ravensmere Hall, a note was delivered to Lady Cassandra Marbury. It was not from Gabriel. It was from her own social secretary, a record of inquiries made, a summary of what was known about a Miss Eliza Hartwell of Ashcombe. Father deceased. No fortune. Parish school teacher. A borrowed reputation built on a dead man's respectability. Cassandra read it at her writing desk, folded it neatly, and sat for a while in thought. Then she picked up her pen. Cassandra moved quietly. That was the thing about her that made her dangerous, not spectacle, but precision. She did not spread rumors. She did not write letters designed to be intercepted. She simply spoke the truth, in the right rooms, to the right people, in tones so reasonable that disagreeing with her felt like disagreeing with arithmetic. She came to Gabriel first. It was a morning call, perfectly timed, early enough to suggest concern rather than calculation, late enough that he had already been at his desk for 2 hours and was in the particular state of focus that makes interruption feel like generosity. She sat across from him with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something that resembled reluctant honesty. "I am not speaking as someone who wishes Miss Hartwell any harm," she began. "I want that understood." Gabriel set down his pen. "She is, by all accounts, a respectable young woman in difficult circumstances." Cassandra's voice was measured, each word placed with the care of someone who knows the floor is uneven. "Which is precisely why your continued attention creates a problem, not for you, Gabriel. You have rank enough to absorb speculation, but for her." A pause. "A poor gentlewoman with no fortune and no family name of consequence cannot survive the wrong kind of notice. If society decides that the Duke of Ravensmere has been paying her particular attention, and then, as duty and sense must eventually require, turns his attention elsewhere, it is not you who will carry the cost of that story." She was not shouting. She was not cruel. She was presenting a logical argument in a reasonable tone, and every word of it was true enough to be difficult to answer. Gabriel said, "You are suggesting I withdraw for her protection." "I am suggesting," Cassandra said gently, "that you consider what you are actually offering her, before you offer it." She left shortly after, satisfied, Eliza thought, or would have thought, had she known the conversation had taken place, with the kind of satisfaction that comes from having planted something that only needs time. Cassandra visited Eliza 3 days later. She arrived at the cottage with a small gift, preserves from her estate, wrapped in cloth, and the manner of a woman paying a neighborly call. Mrs. Hartwell, who was nobody's fool but understood the social geometry of refusing Lady Cassandra Marbury at her front door, let her in and made tea. The conversation was pleasant for its first 10 minutes. Then, in a lull, with the cups still warm and her voice still perfectly kind, Cassandra said, "You are a sensible woman, Miss Hartwell. That has always been clear." She turned her cup slightly in its saucer. "So I imagine you understand that men of Gabriel's position, of any elevated position, sometimes find themselves drawn to feeling in unusual directions. Particularly when they have been recently moved by an act of genuine courage." She looked at Eliza directly. "Gratitude is a powerful emotion. It can resemble something else entirely, for a time." Eliza said nothing. "I say this," Cassandra continued, "because I think you deserve the honest version of it, rather than the one that requires discovering it yourself later. A duke may feel deeply and still marry where duty requires. It has always been so." She set her cup down. "I would not want you to be harmed by something that was never in your power to change." She left the preserves and departed with perfect courtesy. The cottage was very quiet afterward. Mrs. Hartwell said nothing, which was a measure of how badly she wanted to say something. Eliza sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the window and told herself that everything Cassandra had said was reasonable. That it was probably true. That she had known some version of it since the beginning and had been foolish to let the garden walk and the library and the architectural plans for a reading room make her forget it. She had been foolish. She resolved, with the steady discipline she applied to most difficult things, not to be foolish again. Can you sense what is about to break, not dramatically, but quietly, the way the most painful things usually do? Gabriel noticed within the week. He had asked her opinion on the lodge's interior arrangements, where the reading tables should sit relative to the windows, whether the younger children's room needed a separate entrance. She had answered correctly, helpfully, and with a distance so precise it could only have been constructed. He watched her for a moment. "You have changed," he said. "I am the same as I have always been, Your Grace." The title landed between them like a closed door. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, what has been said to you?" "Nothing that wasn't true." "Eliza." "I will not," she said, with the composure of someone who has rehearsed this, become an object of noble curiosity. "I will not be the village school teacher that the Duke of Ravensmere found interesting for a season." Her voice did not waver. "I have too little to lose and you have too much to risk, and I think we have both understood that from the beginning." Gabriel looked at her for a long moment. "You have never been an amusement to me," he said. The words were quiet and entirely serious. Eliza met his eyes. "Then what have I been?" The question hung between them, clean, direct, unanswerable in the way that the most important questions are unanswerable, because answering them does not simply describe a situation but creates one. Gabriel opened his mouth. Closed it. Said, finally, with the difficulty of a man whose instinct has always been control and who is finding that instinct inadequate, "I cannot answer that here." "No," Eliza agreed softly. "I don't suppose you can." She gathered her notes about the lodge arrangements and left him standing in the cold with the particular expression of a man who has just discovered that the thing he has been most afraid of losing is already in the process of walking away. The lodge opened on a Saturday in late November. The morning was cold and clear, frost still on the grass, the sky the particular pale blue that belongs only to late autumn and carries within it, if you are paying attention, the first suggestion of what winter is about to cost. Villagers arrived in small groups along the lane, tenants, estate workers, mothers with children who had been told there would be something worth seeing. They came with the cautious curiosity of people who have been surprised before by things that turned out to be less than promised. What they found was this: a building transformed. The old hunting lodge, which most of them had known only as a locked and slightly ominous presence at the estate's edge, had been opened, extended, and made warm. New windows let in the low winter light. Long reading tables ran the length of the central room. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled, many of them from the Ravensmere library, Eliza knew, with volumes arranged by size and subject with the care of someone who believed that children's hands deserved to find things easily. A fire burned in the central hearth, large enough to warm the whole room. And along the far wall, mounted in a glass case at eye level, was the old hunting gun. The silverwork caught the light. The engraved crest was clearly visible. Below the case, a small brass plate had been fixed to the wall. The inscription read, "In memory of Edward Ashford and Nathaniel Ashford. This place was kept closed by grief. It is opened now by the same love that caused it." Eliza read it once. Then she looked away, because she needed a moment and did not want anyone to see her need it. What do you think it cost Gabriel to write those words and put them where everyone could read them? Gabriel stood at the front of the room when the villagers had gathered, and he spoke without notes and without performance. He was not a man given to public sentiment, and he did not manufacture any now. He said that the lodge had been closed for many years because he had not known what to do with it. He said that it had taken a fire and an act of courage from someone who owed him nothing to show him that a place kept locked by grief was still a place, and that places, like people, could be made useful again. He paused. "This room stands," he said, "because Miss Hartwell saw worth where others would have seen only smoke and ruin." He did not look at her when he said it. He did not need to. The room did the looking for him. Eliza stood near the back beside her aunt, and she felt the word settle over her, not like praise. She had not come here for praise, but like a correction. A public, deliberate, unhurried correction of the first night, when she had stood in the rain with his family's heirloom in her blackened hands and been called a thief before his men. He had wounded her publicly. He was restoring her publicly. She understood the difference, and it cost her more than she had expected. Mrs. Hartwell touched her arm briefly, said nothing, and looked straight ahead. Cassandra stood near the door in a dark coat, her expression entirely composed. She understood what had just happened. Eliza could see it in the stillness of her, the quality of a woman who has played her best hand and watched it lose to something she had underestimated. Afterward, when the children had begun to settle at the reading tables and the adults had divided into the conversational clusters that form naturally at any gathering, Eliza stepped outside. She needed air. She needed a moment where no one was watching her compose herself. The path outside the lodge ran along the edge of the estate woodland, bare branch now, frost still edging the ground in shadow. The cold was clean and immediate. She stood with her hands clasped and looked at the tree line and breathed. She heard his steps on the gravel a moment later. Gabriel stopped a few feet behind her. Not close enough to crowd. Far enough to make it a choice if she wanted to walk away. She did not walk away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Gabriel said, "At first, you were a woman I had wronged." His voice was quiet. Deliberate. The voice of a man who has decided, finally, fully, without the protection of ambiguity, to say the thing. Then you became a woman I could not stop admiring. Then the person whose judgment I looked for before I made decisions I used to make alone. He paused. I told myself it was gratitude. Then I told myself it was respect. I ran out of things to tell myself approximately 3 weeks ago. Eliza did not turn around. "That is a very controlled way of describing something," she said. "I am a controlled man." A beat. "I am trying not to be, at the moment." She turned then. He looked, not like the feared Duke, not like the cold and careful man who had dismounted in the rain and called her a thief, but like someone standing at the edge of something he has decided to cross without knowing what is on the other side. "I thought you saved an heirloom from the fire," he said. "I was wrong. You saved the part of me that had mistaken silence for strength." The wind moved through the bare branches overhead. Eliza looked at him for a long moment, at the careful honesty of his expression, at the effort it had cost him to stand here without the armor of his title and say this, and she felt the full weight of the past week settle into something clear. "Admiration is not enough," she said. "If the next time society disapproves, you choose silence over what you know to be right, then none of this will have meant what you want it to mean." "I know. I am not asking for a promise about society," she continued. "I am asking whether you understand the difference between what you are expected to do and what you actually intend." Gabriel held her gaze steadily. "I intend," he said, "to ask your permission to court you. Properly. Not as a duke offering charity below his rank. Not as a man managing an inconvenient feeling." He paused. "As Gabriel. If you are willing to receive him." And what do you think Eliza will say, and not as a woman calculating odds, but as a woman who has never once stopped knowing her own mind? Eliza was quiet for a moment. Not because she did not know her answer, but because some answers deserve to be given their full weight before they are spoken. "Then do not come to me as the feared Duke," she said. "Then I shall come as Gabriel," he said, "if you will receive him." "I will," she said. It was not a grand declaration. There were no witnesses, no performance, no ceremony. Just two people standing on a frost-edged path with the sound of children's voices drifting through the lodge windows behind them, warm and unself-conscious, the sound of a room being used for the first time in years. Gabriel stood beside her, not in front of her. That was the difference. That was all of it, really. The lodge glowed from within as the afternoon light began to thin. Through the windows, the children sat at the long tables with books open in their hands, the fire at the far end of the room casting everything in amber. On the wall, the old hunting gun rested behind its glass, the brass plate below it catching the light, opened now by the same love that caused it, and the room around it doing exactly what Gabriel had asked of it, being used, being warm, being alive. Eliza had saved the hunting gun from the fire. But the greater rescue had been quieter than that, and longer, and made of smaller things, a scorched shawl strip, a strip of honest conversation, an apology that was not enough until it was followed by something real. She had not conquered the feared Duke by beauty, or flattery, or calculation. She had simply refused, from the first wet night on the lawn to this cold and clear November afternoon, to let grief have the final word over him. And Gabriel Ashford, Duke of Ravensmere, who had spent years being feared, and found it an acceptable substitute for being known, was learning, at last, that there was a difference.